So if you guys are like thinking about this process, and if you're early enough, definitely start looking and start asking these questions.
Cheril, welcome to the Premed years. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to chat with you and really learn about your story. And I think your story is going to help a lot of students who are in similar situations. But I want to start with my favorite question. When did you realize you wanted to be a physician?
Yes, that question. I've been practicing it just for you. But I guess for me, I've always been really good at science and math. And in high school, I realized that I really loved meeting new people. So I thought the health professions would be a good fit for me. And then college hit, and I did the basic pre-health biology track. After my first year, I became a CNA, and I got to really be there with patients and be a part of the patient care team and form these like meaningful relationships. And that really set in stone of like me wanting to be a physician, like that I wanted to lead the care team to impact these patients and continue helping others.
There are a lot of students who are good at math and like science and want to help people. Did you have any familial influences on wanting to become a physician? Anybody in your family in healthcare, nurses, doctors, anybody like that?
Actually, no. I guess the only thing would be my sister who became a respiratory technician during my second and third years of college, but that was about it.
A little bit later, after you
Yeah.
already were on this path. Interesting. What do you think it was about healthcare that stood out for you? Because again, a lot of people are smart and like science and want to help people and still aren't called to healthcare. What do you think it was for you?
I guess like those interactions with those patients, because being a CNA in the rehab floor, we had a lot of geriatric patients, and I purposely tried to take all the time I could to get to know them, get to know their stories, and in that way, um, been able to like cheer them on when they were feeling anxious. And some of them really had trouble, like because it was a rehab floor with broken hips and stuff. They had a hard time walking, but just slowly like encouraging them, filling them with confidence, being there for them, and that really like touched me deep in a sense, and I just wanted to continue that feeling.
Nice. Let's talk about, I think the biggest part of this conversation will be that you are a dreamer, a DACA student. And so I get so many questions about, do I have any DACA information? Have I ever had a dreamer on? And you're my first one. So thank you for reaching out and volunteering to tell your story, to tell those who are listening about some of those struggles that are unique to dreamers. But let's start with really the permission that you gave yourself to actually go down this path, knowing that there are potential hurdles in place as a DACA applicant. When did you get the courage or the permission or whatever it is that I'm trying to say to actually know, like, I'm going to be a doctor. I don't care if I have a legal status in this country or not. This is what I want to do.
Yeah, and that one was a tough point. That was a tough point to get to, but I think it really started when I think in 2017 as a DACA recipient, the Trump administration shut down that program, and then they give Congress 6 months, and that was probably some of the worst times in my life, where constantly I was checking the news every day, hoping that there would be an answer, hoping that there would be something better, and ultimately just not finding anything. So during that time, I did a lot of like self-reflection, talked to my support system, and thought about the experiences that I've been through, and realized that at the end of the day, there's going to always be obstacles, but I have enough confidence in myself to know that I can pursue these goals wherever it be, however it can be. Like I'll just keep working hard and trying to get through it, take it one step at a time if I have to. And thankfully, here I am.
Here you are. How did you go about actually doing the research to say, can a dreamer actually apply to a U.S. medical school, get into a U.S. medical school? How did you do that research and ask those questions?
Yeah, it was actually just a lot of Google searching. It was a lot of going online, typing DACA recipients, med schools. And one really big pillar that like gave me hope was a school in Chicago was some of the first ones to accept DACA recipients, and they were DACA medical students. So it helped that there were some other people in the position that I wanted to be.
Yeah.
I never really contacted them, but just like having that little bit of hope gave me a lot of hope. And during the time when the Trump administration wanted to shut down the program, the AMC gave a very profound message supporting DACA, and that was reassuring. So from that, I thought, okay, if these medical schools are willing to take DACA applicants, then I have a shot.
Yeah. What do you think is different for a DACA applicant to medical school versus a normal, a quote unquote normal applicant?
Yeah, there is a lot of differences for specifically like application wise. I think 160 medical schools in the U.S., only about 70 accept DACA applicants. A lot of state schools. I'm from Tennessee, and in my undergrad, there was a state medical school right across the street. Sadly, I couldn't apply there because they didn't accept DACA applicants. So you have to you have to really hone in on your school list and ask these questions of like, if these students or if these schools do accept DACA applicants, how do they do it, and what kind of support that they could provide.
How did you reach out to schools and say, here's who I am, here's my story, will you accept me, please take me?
I wish I did, but no. Thankfully, MSAR had a really good information right there where it says if DACA applications are accepted by these schools, and if so, if there's any special consideration. I applied to both MD and DO schools. Sadly, DO schools didn't have that information up front. So I had to email and call all 36 DO schools in the United States personally and ask them if they do take DACA applications. And if they do they consider us in-state, out-of-state? Is there any special circumstance that I need to do? And there was about 12 that did accept these applications. And I made a little spreadsheet of it, and I think I posted it in your Facebook group too.
Nice. I'm gonna have to grab that and just make a post on my website so people can Google it and find it.
Sure.
That'd be great. So, talk about the undergrad process. Maybe there's someone listening to this as a high school student who is a DACA recipient, or in community college, wondering about that next step to go to university as a DACA recipient. What was that process like to go to school as a dreamer?
Yeah. For the most part, it was pretty normal. The hardest parts about it are just getting into schools and then also like finding funding for school. Because as a DACA recipient, we don't really have access to any federal resources, including Hope scholarships, Pell Grants, federal student loans even. So thankfully, like I received an honor scholarship that paid my tuition, and I lived with my mom during undergrad so I could save costs. But figuring out like the best way just to get into school and like how you're going to fund it. And that was really it. But other than that, you're just a typical student, except that you have to renew every 2 years and you have to go through some hassles with like paperwork.
Renew your DACA status?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And all of that has to be passed to the school, I'm assuming.
Thankfully, the schools don't really, or at least my school didn't really ask for that information every 2 years.
Nice.
I think like for them, it was as long as I got in, I was okay.
Yeah. That's nice. So I think that's always a big question mark for students is the funding part of it. So it sounds like you were blessed enough, you worked hard enough in high school that you had good grades, you got a merit-based scholarship to go to undergrad. What's that process like for medical school? Because I'm assuming it's very similar to an international medical student where you still don't have access to those federal funds. How are medical schools treating DACA recipients in terms of asking for money and how you're going to pay for school?
Yeah, and that was like a big worry point about me for starting school. Sadly, still can't apply for federal student loans that a lot of my peers do. And medical school scholarships are a little bit harder to come by. So I've had to personally just rely on private student loans. And the two main companies that I was looking at was Sallie Mae and Discover. But with that process, as a DACA recipient, you still have to find a cosigner that has worthy credit. So if you guys are like thinking about this process, and if you're early enough, definitely start looking and start asking these questions about who can be your co-signer.
What does that process look like in terms of just loan terms and all that? Are they pretty competitive to federal loans?
One company was ridiculously high, and me and my family just could not handle that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to name names, but the
It's up to
other
you.
company, yeah, I'll just say it. I have no shame. Sallie Mae interest rates were really high for me and my family, and we just couldn't handle that burden.
Yeah.
But Discover Student Loans was a lot more financially reasonable for us, and they were fairly competitive. So I felt like, it was a good choice.
Yeah. Did you do a lot of research into, and this is just from my background understanding private loans versus federal loans, and while you're in residency, a lot of students will forbear their loans, meaning they don't have to pay them back for a while. Obviously, they're still earning interest. One of the biggest kind of catches with private loans is a lot of them don't necessarily have that forbearance built in, and even in residency, you still have to pay back those loans when you're not making a lot of money as a resident. Are these loans specific for medical students, and you have some flexibility there with that? Did you look into that kind of stuff?
Yeah, thankfully, both of those companies did have like health professional loans specifically geared towards medical school. And I think they understand the process of like residency and deferment. So
yeah,
there's a couple options there.
Yeah. What has been the hardest part about the pre-med process for you, whether it's DACA related or not?
I honestly think the hardest part for me was because that we talked about the DACA recipients and the DACA cards being only 2-year terms.
Mm-hmm.
I started kind of never planning for the future because everything was on a whim. You never knew what was going to happen the next day. So it's really hard to like plan for the future. So I could only think in like really short intervals. And that was pretty hard of planning because, medical school planning takes a couple of years and you have to have somewhat of good foresight. But it was like fighting those two aspects and just kind of just having that hope and belief that somehow, some way things were going to work out.
Yeah. Talk about for a second, for someone who doesn't really understand what a DACA recipient is or who a DACA recipient is and how you get that status. Talk a little bit about your journey to the States and what that actually means in the kind of grand scheme of things.
Yeah. So I was born in India, and then around like 5 years old, my parents moved to Canada, lived there for about 5 years. And then we came to the United States without the proper documentation. And I've lived in very nomadic childhood of Alabama, Florida, New Hampshire, Mississippi, Florida, Tennessee. And then with all that, in high school, DACA had just started and is a program for letting children that came into the United States undocumented before a certain date, before the age of 16, to allow them to have a social security and a worker's permit. And that really, during high school, I didn't really think too much of it. And I was like, oh, cool, like I can drive now. Like typical high schoolers do.
That's the most important thing as a high schooler.
Yeah, for sure. That freedom is unparalleled.
Yep.
But once you get to, once I started like actually looking at colleges and thinking about my future, that's when the program really like had its benefits for me, where I believe that it would allow me to like reach these higher educational goals that I had for myself.
Yeah. And what's the process for you as a DACA recipient to hopefully eventually get your citizenship or at least permanent resident status? Or is that just, it's all up to the administration and the courts at this point?
I don't know too much about it currently, but the only options that I've seen so far is yes, like the first option is hopefully the administration will find a legal pathway for us. If not, the other option is marrying somebody that is a citizen and then getting your legal status through that.
Yeah. Well, that's why I went to medical school, to find myself a sugar mama. So hopefully you can find your sugar partner at medical school as well.
Here's hoping.
So fingers crossed. There we go. So it's interesting. I think a lot of students potentially don't understand whether you're a DACA recipient or an undocumented immigrant in this country, that you actually participate in taxes and do all of that as well. So I think there's a lot of misinformation about what you all actually do out there in the world and for this country. And so anyway, talk about the medical school application process and the interview process. What do you think stands out for you as a DACA recipient? Did it come up at all during your interviews? Was there anything different about your applications? Talk about that.
Yeah. I personally made it a point for it to come up because this is, I think, like you've mentioned on some of your podcasts that I've listened, is that these med schools want enriching experiences with students, and they want different students with different experiences. And I believe that being a DACA recipient, you have this experience into like these communities that not many people have. So I personally made sure to write about being a DACA recipient. And during the interview, I would add, if they would ask any about like overcoming challenges, DACA would be the first thing I would talk about. And I would share with them my struggles and my successes. And thankfully, most of them responded to it well.
Yeah. Do you think there's a difference? I think someone listening to this who's maybe of Latin descent, coming from South America or Mexico as a DACA recipient, do you think there's a difference for them versus you as a DACA recipient from India?
I think so. Just because there are some biases within the Latin community of like undocumented immigrants, which I thankfully haven't had to face, but they do exist. And I haven't really been able to be a part of communities of like other DACA students. I've usually been like one of the only ones that I personally know about. So those are the only things I can think about, but I just don't really have that much insight to give a better answer.
Yeah. So just potentially some more bias out there. I think obviously you as South Asian, is that India, South Asia?
Yeah.
South Asian descent, obviously I think a lot of people stereotypically wouldn't think of someone from South Asia, so Indian descent, to be a DACA recipient, but obviously DACA isn't specifically just for Latin or Hispanic immigrants. So just something else to think about in this journey. Talk about being in medical school. You talked about the administration, and it was only last year or several months ago, I forget when it was, that the Supreme Court made a DACA decision, a temporary one, that I think a lot of people on the left thought it was a win, a lot of people on the right thought it was a win, and nobody really knows what's going on. Talk about just that constant fear and pressure. You're supposed to be in medical school learning this new skill and this new knowledge that you're supposed to build upon to be a future healer, and yet you're always, in my mind, I would assume you're always kind of looking over your shoulder going, am I going to have to leave school tomorrow? What is that like?
No, yeah, that's a good point. It's really tough, honestly. And I'm usually one of the go with the flow, relaxed sort of person and just take it a step at a time. But it's really hard not to worry about those things because this is ultimately like where I want to be. And just thinking about having to leave is very heartbreaking. So based on that, actually, it's kind of sad right now because with the decision from the administration, instead of 2-year renewals, now it's only been shortened down to 1-year renewals. Yeah. But with all that, just at the end of the day, you can't, for me, I've kind of given up hope that I can change anything from an administrative standpoint. So the only thing that I can control is how I work around it, how I view things. So I just try to take things a day at a time, and I'll cross those challenges and those bridges when they come up. But that doesn't mean I'm going ignorant into these things. I've talked to deans of my medical school to see like what options there would be if I couldn't continue at school, or if my legal status does change.
Yeah.
And thankfully, they've been really supportive here for me.
From a psychological standpoint, I'd almost want to ask the question, like, why even bother? Why put yourself through this in this country, in a country that potentially, from at least from an administrative standpoint, uh, doesn't seem like it wants you here? Why not go up to Canada and go to medical school and go practice in Canada?
No, I have definitely thought about that too. But at the end of the day, even whatever the administration or others view me as, I view myself as just as American as my peers. I've rooted myself in these communities. I want to help the people that I've met so far. I want to be a good impact around here. And I guess like that's what kind of keeps me going, and just the goals that I have set for myself.
Yeah, that's awesome. What is? Let's get a little personal here, if it's okay. Talk about from a family situation. I think obviously you came to Canada at 5. You came to the States at 10, roughly. Talk about the kind of emotion that you have around your parents. You being in this situation now, going like, why didn't you do this the right way? why are you making my life so hard? Is there that sort of torment around family life, or you're like, it's just is what it is, and I'm glad to be here anyway?
Maybe there was a small thought of that,
Yeah.
but all of it nowadays, and just this greatness of just realizing the sacrifice of my parents and just looking up to them and respecting them.
Yeah.
Because they did this because they wanted a better lives for me and my brother. And that's what I feel like a lot of immigrants are here for, because they want better lives for their family, for their children, for themselves, so they can achieve dreams that they never would, that weren't possible for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have a resentment for that for them. I'm thankful that whatever challenges that they went through, they did it on my behalf. So it's always from a grateful attitude that I think about their choices.
Nice. That's perfect. What's the hardest part of medical school for you? Wait, before I ask that one, talk to me about the day you received your acceptance. What was that like for you?
Man, that was so surreal. It was so cool. The school that I'm going to now was actually my first interview and my first acceptance. And I got that acceptance when I was on another interview, actually. Yeah.
Peace out. I don't need you anymore.
That's exactly. Oh, actually, that's not how it felt, but it was just so cool. I guess like to like more in depth of that story, I was in New England and I had a friend in Boston, and he picked me up, and it was around Valentine's Day. We were going on like Boston Pier, and we could see the water and the docks. And I got a call around 6 o'clock saying like, "Hello, is this Cheril?" And I'm like, "Yes, who is this?" And they said, "This is Dean so and so from so and so medical school. I'm here to give you an acceptance." And I think like I didn't hear him properly. I said, "Are you sure you have the right person?" And they said, "Yeah, this is the number that you gave us." And I was like, "Oh crap, this is really setting in." And as soon as I ended the call a little bit more gracefully, I started screaming. I just started screaming and running around. I was like, "Oh my God, I'm in. And I immediately called my parents.
Yeah. And how did they take the news?
Oh, they took it so well. They were so happy and they were so excited.
Yeah. It's like all of their sacrifices finally paid off. At least the first step of paying off, you getting into school.
Yeah. I think it may have meant more to them than it did to me at that moment, but I never really talked to them about it that in depth.
Yeah. So let's go back to the other question. What's the hardest part of medical school? Obviously, we're in COVID time, so everything is different right now. But do you potentially think that's helped you with the transition to medical school? Do you think it's hurt? What's this process been like for you?
Medical school is a beast. We're currently in anatomy, so there's just like so much content.
There's a little bit to know about the body, yeah.
Yeah. But you just take that a day at a time. But for me, because of the COVID situation and not being able to be as social as I would like, it's been a little bit harder. because I think I'm a little bit of a social person. But with that, you just take one thing a day at a time. And especially as me being a DACA recipient, I think I learned a lot about resiliency. And that's definitely hopefully going to come in handy for the rest of my medical training.
Nice. What do you think the future holds for you?
Hopefully graduation.
Hopefully being able to stay in the States, being able to graduate. Do you have a specialty in mind?
Right now I don't. I'm kind of like interested in a lot of things, but just based on personality, I kind of like chaos and like seeing different things and diversity of aspect, maybe emergency medicine.
Yep.
But I'm open to all suggestions.
Open to all. Good. Keep an open mind, and when you start all of your rotations and stuff, just soak it all in. What's the biggest piece of advice that you could give to a DACA recipient out there who is struggling on their journey, wondering if medical school is an option for them?
Yeah. I guess the biggest piece of advice is to reflect on yourself, reflect on your experiences in a positive way. That DACA recipients have had to overcome a lot, have had to overcome like all the emotional and mental stress of just being a part of that program. And think about all that you've done and just have confidence in yourself that you can do this and that you will do this. And I guess like ultimately that's it. And just rely on your support system and just keep chipping away at it.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the application process, right? There's a lot that goes into an application, a personal statement, all of your extracurriculars. For the MD application, there's the disadvantaged essay, there's all the secondary essays. How much did you either purposefully try to force in or keep out the fact that you're a DACA recipient?
Yeah. So with the primary application and the disadvantaged essay, I did talk about my status as a DACA recipient and overcoming these challenges, because I had talked to a Premed advisor and I asked her if that was okay to put down, and she was very supportive of that. Yeah. And retrospectively thinking back on it, there are some hurdles that you have to go through as a DACA recipient that you absolutely should share.
Yeah.
For the secondaries, I only talked about DACA and my status if it was applicable to that question. If it asked about like what was the biggest thing that you've had to overcome,
yeah,
and a big difficulty, and like how you've learned from it, or how do you show resilience.
Yeah. But
other than that, I would answer it like just other questions I would answer normally with whatever experiences that I did have.
Yeah, good. And that's the perfect answer, I think. A lot of people try to force in their agenda into every question. And it's just like, you didn't really answer the question. It's like a very politician way of answering a question. Be like, that's a good question, but I want to talk about this over here. So obviously it worked for you. What was the final tally with number of schools you applied to, number of interviews and acceptances that you had?
Yeah, I applied to a lot more schools. I applied to probably, I think it was 32 schools in total.
Nice.
Which is a lot of writing, but in my head,
a lot of money.
A lot of money too.
Let me ask you just a quick side question there. Yeah. As a DACA recipient, does the AAMC allow you to apply for the FAP, the Fee Assistance Program?
Do.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I didn't apply for it because I think it asked for parental income. And my dad, thankfully, he had worked his way up to owning a small business. So,
good.
We were relatively okay with financials, and he was always about the education. So he helped me out a lot with those application fees.
Yeah.
But with that, about 32 schools. I've received 5 interview invites, went on 4 of them, and got 3 acceptances and a hold. Yeah.
That's successful by any measure. And how did you come to pick the school that you ultimately chose? How much potentially was there in terms of diversity and will they accept me as a DACA applicant? How much did that play into choosing where you wanted to go?
No, that played a pretty big part, because I had mentioned earlier, I made it a point sometimes to talk about my DACA status during these interview processes. And I would personally, at the end of the day, if I could talk to a dean or anybody in the admissions committee and talk to them about my status and my worries about them, and just ask them what they could do or how they would be able to support them. And thankfully, a lot of these medical schools were very receptive and very supportive. Um, but at the end of the day, I just picked the school that I felt like would be the greatest fit for me, with the DACA status, with the support, and also my personality too.
Awesome. So outside of being a DACA recipient, for anyone listening, any pre-med listening, what advice would you have for them on their journey to medical school?
Yeah. I would say do extracurricular activities that you're really fond of. Do things that you can talk about well and be excited for. Personally, for me, I was a storytelling minor in my undergrad.
Nice.
Which is kind of unique, right? But I really enjoyed that aspect. I got to do bedside volunteering at a hospital and tell stories to ICU patients and then ask them if they reduced in pain. It was a really cool experience just because I just pursued what I liked.
Nice.
And
you sit at their bedside and read Llama Llama, Red Pajama?
That's exactly what it was. Sometimes they'd fall asleep, but I took that as a win.
That's awesome. Sorry, continue.
No, that's about it. It's just pursue what you are passionate about. Pursue what you feel like that you want to do. And even if you try different things, don't worry, just keep trying. It's really helpful in the secondaries. It's really helpful in like your extracurriculars, being able to talk about like what impact these activities have given me.
Yep.
And looking back on it, it's like you also have these fond memories.